Okay, technical difficulties, sorry. Dobry din. This is my first time in Ukraine, and I've been here a couple days. I must say, Kyiv is a stunningly beautiful city. So I'm going to be talking about a number of things today, starting with a bit of typography, then a bit about web fonts, followed by how East Asian typography and modern CSS can inspire web layouts that are different from the standard 12-column grid designs that we see almost everywhere. So I'm going to assume most people here speak English and maybe Ukrainian or Russian, but does anybody here actually speak Chinese? Oh, this is great, love this. So I love emojis, and if you didn't know, there are 2,666 emojis to choose from today. So it's totally possible to introduce myself using emojis. So like Bruce said, I'm from Malaysia, and I played basketball for half of my life. It was what kick-started my web career. I'm a front-end engineer who loves CSS, so I sometimes write blog posts about CSS and web design. And I also happen to be a Mozilla Tech Speaker, which is an initiative by Mozilla to support technical evangelists in regional communities across the world. Now, what do you think about when you hear the word typography? It might seem like something that artsy creative types care about, but these days it seems that typography is catching the attention of mainstream media. We have big brand names like Netflix and National Geographic talking extensively about their font redesigns. There was a Supreme Court case in Pakistan where the Microsoft font Calibri was a crucial piece of evidence that proved the forgery of financial documents. So that's a bit crazy. What is typography? So there are a lot of definitions out there, but I settled on this one by Garrett Notje, that typography is writing with prefabricated letters. Now, letters are a type of grapheme, which is the smallest unit of a writing system of any given language. Writing systems are visual representations of verbal communication, a means to record whatever we say in our respective languages for storage and transfer. Now, the world is very diverse when it comes to language and culture, so it's only natural that there are many different writing systems used all over the planet. Now, a majority of the world use writing systems that consist of alphabets. So this is a small sampling of a bunch of different alphabets from different languages. Now, before I came to Ukraine, I tried to learn a little bit of Ukrainian. Now, I'm still terrible at it, but I can sort of say things like "Ви розмовляєте англійською," which I'm told meant, "Do you speak English?" Now, if that was wrong, I've probably been saying something inappropriate since Saturday, so I also learned that the Ukrainian alphabet has 33 letters. That's 7 more letters than the English alphabet, which has 26 letters. The point I'm trying to make here is that alphabetic writing systems utilize a small set of letters to form all the words that the language needs for the purpose of communication. But Chinese is a bit different in that it's a logographic language. Chinese characters number in the tens of thousands, and each character is a unique glyph that can express meaning on its own or be used in combination with other glyphs. So let's take a look at a few examples. This is hippopotamus. It's an English word. It's 12 letters. In Chinese, we only need 2 characters. Hema. Мистецтвознавчення. So this is a Ukrainian word. It takes 16 letters to spell. And in Chinese, we can say, wait. Grünheiferdeuter. This is an Irish word of 21 letters. And again, in Chinese, we can say, 摄影. So Chinese is a pretty concise language. And although a large swath of the world mostly reads from left to right, writing systems can go in all directions. Modern-day vertical writing applies in East Asian languages, utilizing Han characters, so languages like Chinese, Korean, Japanese. And they're read from right to left. Mongolian also uses vertical writing, but is read from left to right. Now, Han characters are sometimes called square characters, because each character is composed within a uniform square, which allows Chinese to be read efficiently, regardless of whether it's typeset horizontally or vertically. So Chinese texts can be typeset into neat rows and columns, and if you don't understand Chinese, you may not know which direction the text is going. It could be vertical, right to left, or horizontal, top to bottom. So Chinese script is said to have developed separately from the Proto-Sinaitic scripts, which were the origins of alphabetic languages. And this is potentially why the Indo-European writing systems differ so greatly from that of East Asia. And as different alphabetic systems branched out from the Phoenician alphabet, their letter forms evolved and changed. The appearances of letter forms were directly influenced by the tools that were used to create them. So the Latin alphabet came from the Greek alphabet, and the earliest letters were sans serif simply because writing was done with a hard-read pen. Now, serifs may have came about due to a transition to a square-cut writing implement, like a flat, stiff brush. And later, scribes and copyists started using quill pens. And as demand for written matter grew, they had to write faster, so they developed more efficient styles of writing. So the letter forms changed yet again. Now, Chinese characters also evolved greatly, since the earliest glyphs were scratched into turtle shells and animal bones as far back as 1600 BCE. This early script was called oracle bone script because ancient rulers would use them to ask various higher powers important questions about topics like agriculture, weather, warfare, things like that. And the key implement of writing was the brush. So calligraphy was and still is one of the most highly regarded Chinese arts. Not so much origami. But anyway, the works of famous calligraphers were used as the basis for carving wood blocks used for printing, which was also invented in China. So these days, typefaces used for printing Chinese publications, there are mainly 4 families. We have Song Ti, Kai Ti, Fang Song Ti, and Hei Ti. So Chinese typefaces are extremely challenging to create, simply due to the volume of glyphs required. The average number of glyphs for a Chinese system font clocks in at around 35,000 glyphs, give or take a few thousand. So this is a quote from an article on Quartz that covered the process of creating a Chinese font. And it's a pretty interesting read, which goes into how much effort is needed to design and create a Chinese typeface. For a typeface to be viably used as body copy, it will probably need a minimum of around 7,000 glyphs for simplified Chinese and 13,000 glyphs for traditional Chinese. That's a lot of glyphs. So Chinese fonts are almost always created by teams over a period of years. Now, for the longest time, writing has been done on analog mediums. Etchings on bone, inscriptions on stone and bronze. We have printing on parchment and paper. Now, all these things you can feel and you can touch. But the medium of our time now is the screen and the browser. As more and more of our communications move into the digital world, it's important that we preserve language diversity. Languages are representative of human heritage and convey unique cultures. Now, I believe most people in this audience speak multiple languages. And if you think about it, there are certain concepts that just cannot be translated. And of the world's 7.6 billion people, only 5% are native English speakers. But 52% of websites are in English. So this ratio doesn't sit quite right with me. Studies done by the Internet Society have shown that while cost of access is a barrier to getting people online, many non-internet users claim that the internet is simply not relevant or not of interest to them. But if the internet is meant to enhance the free flow of information and ideas across the world, then creation of content on the web should not largely be limited to English-speaking communities. The diversity of thought and perspective in the online world will be greatly enhanced by the participation of cultures and societies who speak all kinds of languages. Which is why internationalization is a priority at the W3C. It is crucial that a technology meant to be ubiquitous supports this creation of local content across the world. That every writing system in the world can be correctly rendered on the web. Now, typography has always been an integral part of human-computer interaction and software design. Rendering text and graphics on an electronic screen is no easy task. If you really think about it, everything we see on a screen has a lot to do with the field of computer graphics. And digital typography is a cross-disciplinary field involving technical engineering, aesthetic design, and mathematical precision. And when we talk about typography on the web, the first thing that comes to mind is web fonts. So let's start with that. What is a font, actually? In the world of metal typesetting, these are fonts. So if you're familiar with letterpress printing, you might have seen drawers containing individual metal sorts. For Chinese fonts, we have type shelves, rows and rows of type shelves. And in the digital world, these are fonts, specifically font files. Now, for both analog and digital fonts, you can think of them as collection of glyphs. So what is a glyph? Now, a glyph is a specific shape of letter or character in a particular font. So this is a glyph. This is a glyph. This is also a glyph. It's all glyphs. In the digital world, everything is data. So glyphs can be described as an array of pixels, or collections of vector images, or even paths of Bezier curves and straight lines. Now, different font formats store information about the font, like their glyphs, their encodings, metadata. They store them differently based on how the specifications were written. And if you've ever used web fonts before, you would have seen this list of font formats. And to understand how we got here, why we have such a long list, we need to go back in time a little bit. Now, Leah touched on this a bit earlier. So the earliest fonts were pixel-based bitmaps, which didn't work out so well when it came to high-resolution printing. So a lot of smart people worked on this problem. And one of the solutions came from Adobe founder John Warnock, who created PostScript in 1985. It was the very first vector font, and it really took off. Now, TrueType was Apple and Microsoft's answer to Adobe's font monopoly. Microsoft later came up with TrueType Open in '94. Then Adobe joined in, and together they developed OpenType. Now, Microsoft wanted to get in the game, came up with Embedded OpenType, or EOT. And they actually submitted this to the W3C, but it got rejected in favor of WOFF, Web Open Font Format. Now, WOFF 2 is just an improvement over WOFF with significantly better compression rates. Now, on the practical side of things, we use the Fontface rule to declare a list of different font formats in the hopes that our fonts will show up correctly in as many browsers as possible. But if you look at the Can I Use charts, you can pretty much get away with using WOFF 2 and WOFF today. Now, the Fontface rule has many descriptors, but only the font family and source. Either of them are absent, the entire Fontface rule is ignored. Now, the font family descriptor is simply a label that we use when we reference the font in later CSS declarations. So maybe you're using Helvetica. You don't have to put Helvetica in the font family. You could use any word, like, say, maybe Veroniki, and it will work just fine. Now, the source descriptor tells the browser where to find the font file. So it could be an external reference or a locally installed font. It also includes an optional font hint. So if the browser doesn't support the font, it won't bother loading the font file at all. So descriptors for style, weight, and stretch are used to match styles to a particular font face when you declare them in later on in your CSS, right? So if you're bored at work, you could try assigning a really thick black typeface to a font weight of 100 and proceed to confuse all your colleagues who cannot figure out why setting a weight of 100 gives them this super thick typeface. I mean, if office pranks are your thing, just saying #don't-get-fired. But then we have the Unicode range descriptor. This one is really fun because it allows us to create composite fonts that mix glyphs from different fonts for different scripts. Let me explain. For example, this whole presentation uses a font called Infini, which unfortunately does not support Cyrillic letters. So I use the Unicode range descriptor to tell my browser to load another font that does have Cyrillic letters called Linux Biolinum, and will use it whenever it encounters any Cyrillic characters. So for Fontface, font family is simply just a label. So what I've done is I've actually created a composite font called Infini, but in actuality, it loads 2 different font files depending on what characters need to be displayed. So I really have to shout out the Firefox DevTools here. If you're doing a lot of design work in the browser, it's really, really awesome. It has like the best grid inspector tool. It has a flexbox inspector. I could go on. But anyway, yeah, there is also this font panel that shows you which fonts are loaded on your page. And if you're using the latest Firefox Nightly 62, you can toggle a brand new font highlighter feature. So here you can see that both Infini, oh, it's a bit blur, I'm sorry, but you can see that both Infini and Biolinim are loaded for my custom Infini font family. So now when I hover over the elements, I can see which characters are actually using which loaded fonts. If a page doesn't contain any Cyrillic characters, Biolinim won't be loaded at all because it's not needed. And all these font descriptors I've talked about so far look very similar to CSS properties, but they're two completely different things. So Chris Lilly, who chaired the group that developed the Fontface rule, explained it really well in his .css talk a few years back, that properties are requests for styling and descriptors are descriptions of capabilities. I really love the example he used, and he said that when you apply Fontface rule within a font weight bold within a Fontface rule, it means that this particular font, it can do bold. But when you use font weight bold as a property, it actually means style this element with a font that can do bold. So CSS Font Properties are our typesetting tools for the web. When you use them in your CSS declarations, imagine that you're running your own printing workshop, and you're telling your apprentice, in this case the browser, that you need a font which is a particular size, style, weight, etc. Then your apprentice then runs off to the back room where all the fonts are kept and tries to find the font that best matches your instructions based on their descriptors, which were assigned in the Fontface rule. I believe most people have used the first 3 or 4 on this list in your style sheets, and Leah already covered how they've been updated to take extra values for variable fonts. She also mentioned the font display property earlier, so I'm just going to talk about the last 2. Now, your browser is a pretty smart apprentice. If a font file can't be found, they're not going to come back empty-handed. They'll find you a fallback font instead. Now, when the fallback font has a lower X height than your first choice font, it might be hard to read. So with font size adjust, you can tell the browser to adjust your font size so it matches the aspect ratio of your first choice font. Now, your smart apprentice can sometimes be a bit too well-meaning, because sometimes the true italic or heavier version of your font doesn't exist. Now, the browser will try to create that effect by itself based on a regular font. And Leah also showed us an example of how it doesn't turn out very nicely. In fact, most Chinese fonts don't have italic variants. And we can set the font synthesis property to a value of none to tell your browser to just leave your font alone. So font feature properties were introduced in fonts level 3, and modern font technologies allow fonts to contain a lot more glyphs than before. So we can use a wide variety of typographic features like swashes and ligatures and things like that. And these are part and parcel of good typography, which is necessary to hold your reader's attention. Attention spans are very short nowadays. And so when we talk about good speakers, we say that they'll do things, they'll vary the cadence, they'll use gestures, they'll emphasize certain words. Now, typographic features do the same for text. So features like old-style numerals and ligatures can also help maintain typographic color to make reading a more comfortable experience. And we can turn these features on and off with CSS now. But note that the font you're using must have these features to begin with. So this lot is pretty common. If you go to any conferences that cover web typography, they'll probably mention any number of these. Almost nobody talks about this property called font variant East Asian. What this property does is that it allows for glyph substitution and positioning in East Asian text. So Han characters seem to be used commonly between Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, but they aren't actually using the same glyphs. So Han unification is something that involves assigning the same code point to different glyphs. And it's been a pretty controversial issue, which I won't get into, but the point is, the same code point can have variant glyphs, depending on the language being used. For example, simplified Chinese glyphs and traditional Chinese glyphs look quite different. So this property allows us to toggle between these variant glyphs. So I know some of you just discovered variable fonts earlier today. Now, version 1.8 of the OpenType specification, which introduced this feature, was actually written in September of 2016. So it's been in a while, more than a year. But this was a joint development by Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Adobe, so it seems like they've learned to work together, right? Now, an OpenType variable font is one in which the equivalent of multiple individual fonts can be packaged into a single font file. So this is a potential big plus when it comes to performance, especially significant for fonts with large glyph sets like all the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean fonts. In addition to that, the dynamism of variable fonts, as Leah expertly showed us earlier this morning, makes it perfect for the web medium. And it opens up the possibility of new kinds of responsive typography. Now, variable fonts is a topic that needs a dedicated session, to be honest. And Lee had already shown us how awesome they can be, so I won't go into much detail here. I'm just going to show you another awesome example of what variable fonts can potentially do. So this demo, is it even running? Oh, yes, it is. This demo was created by a lady called Mandy Michael, who gave an excellent presentation in Singapore earlier this year. There is video of her talk, so I'll share that link in my slides later. And Leah also showed us a site called vfonts.com. So right now I'm going to show you another site called Axis Praxis by Lawrence Penny, which is a playground for the available variable fonts on the web. Taipei-based Type Foundry Arctic Technology created the first Chinese variable font, and you can also play with it on this site, Axis Praxis. Now, vertical writing may be traditionally used for East Asian languages, but you don't have to miss out on the fun just because you don't design for those languages. Vertical layouts are not a new thing. Print design has had plenty of those for quite a while now. And it's just that the web hadn't reached a level of maturity that allowed you to do them well until recently. So I want to introduce the writing mode property, which deals specifically with vertical text. You can literally turn the browser on its side. Now, some people might be saying, this is no big deal. We could always do that with CSS transforms. But not exactly, because changing the writing mode affects the element's box alignment axes. So this is what happens to your text when the different values of writing mode are applied. The default is the first one, horizontal top to bottom, and to change the direction to vertical, you can use values like vertical RL or vertical LR. And when we rotate text, it's not only the lines that change direction, because each line contains individual letters or characters, and they have an orientation as well. So for text orientation, the initial value is mixed. Browsers are smart enough to tell which languages can be typeset both vertically and horizontally, or in one direction only. So Chinese characters, for example, will always be displayed upright, while horizontal-only languages like maybe Ukrainian will have their characters rotated when vertical. Now, the text orientation lets us control this and make all the characters upright or sideways if you want to. Another property is called text combine upright. This addresses the use of numerals and abbreviations in vertical text. A common use case is for dates in Taiwan, and this property lets us fit all the digits into the width of one character and display them upright. No browser supports the digits value yet, which allows us to dictate how many digits are acceptable to be squeezed into this tiny little space. The range allowed theoretically is 2 to 4 characters, but right now we only have the all value. So you could put in long words like Kricheniki, and it would just look horribly squished into that tiny little space. Now, laying out content in a different direction does require a change in perspective. And I learned quite a few insights from working with vertical layouts. For example, the techniques I was so used to for centering items worked a little bit differently with a vertical layout. To vertically center a block, setting top and bottom margins to auto actually does work, which is great. But trying to center something horizontally is a pretty painful experience. Now, these directions of top, bottom, left, and right start getting a bit confusing when you have rotated Latin text, for example. So I have this header, and I want some extra spacing between the header and the text. Would you set the margin on the bottom of the header or the left of the header? You actually set it on the left of the header. And this confuses me, which is why we have something called a CSS Logical Properties specification. So instead of left or right, we use properties like block start or block end or inline start and inline end. Rachel Andrew wrote an in-depth article on CSS Logical Properties, which was published on Smashing Magazine, I think a month ago or so. So you can consider reading it if you haven't. Now, the first public working draft of the specification was published in December last year. It's really new, but I'm eager to see it developed and more widely implemented. A few years ago, I was in a crowded metro train, and I noticed the guy standing in front of me was reading a Chinese novel on his phone. But it was laid out horizontal, top to bottom. So I thought to myself, a vertical layout would work really well for reading Chinese on a phone. Can we do that on the web? So that's how I fell into this rabbit hole of vertical typesetting on the web and learning more about the Chinese language. And as you can see from this demo, the answer to my original question is yes, with all three properties I covered earlier being showcased right. Now, once I figured out that vertical layouts were possible, the next logical step was to have a toggle that allowed readers to switch between vertical and horizontal layouts, because we can do that in Chinese. But it was quite tricky to get images to orientate correctly. It would be nice to have something like maybe a media query for writing modes, so I could lay out my images accordingly, but that doesn't exist yet, so I had to work around it with CSS transforms instead. So yes, there is still work to be done to further develop Chinese typesetting on the web, and for all non-Latin-based languages, actually. The Chinese Layout Task Force, which I am part of, aims to document requirements for the layout and presentation of text from major languages of China when they're used by web standards, like Hanzi, Mongolian, Tibetan, and Uyghur scripts. And there are task forces for other languages as well, like Hebrew or Arabic. Now, implementing vertical layouts has become much easier as browser vendors continue to improve the functionality of their products. So this opens up an aspect of graphic design that isn't often seen on the web at the moment. For example, you can make a bookshelf-style list of posts with just CSS. Something like this can be done by applying vertical RL to each list item, then add some padding and box shadows for the visual effect, and get something like this. Or we could use it for headers. Now, normally we wouldn't think of laying out long chunks of text vertically for, say, Latin-based left-to-right languages, but using vertical text for short titles or headers can break up the monotony of a really long page. Other subtle uses of vertical text could be for tags on blog posts, for example, or wherever information is not critical to the main content. So laying out vertically doesn't adversely affect the reading experience. If you're working in a language meant to be read horizontally, vertical text should largely be decorative because, again, we don't want to compromise the reading experience. So at smaller screens, we can make use of media queries to revert back to a horizontal layout that makes better use of the limited space. But on the other hand, there are instances where text rotated vertically can work on narrow screen sizes as well. Now, studies have shown that the hamburger menu is not an intuitive design axiom at all. So depending on the number of links in your navigation, laying them out vertically along the side edge could be a design worth considering. And I'm sure many of you can come up with even more interesting designs that utilize vertical layout. Statistically, there aren't that many sites that use the writing mode property. So when I started building vertical layouts, Grid hadn't shipped yet. I used Flexbox for a lot of the layout. Now, Flexbox support is brilliant. It has wider coverage than border radius. But when you use Flexbox with writing mode, support is quite iffy. There are quite a large number of cross-browser issues. But that doesn't mean we should just shy away from using vertical text altogether. In fact, this is the best time to use new CSS features. Because, like Leah said earlier, evergreen browsers are a thing now, bug fixes and new features are being shipped faster than ever. And by raising bugs that we find when trying out new features, we are telling browser vendors that these features are in demand. Conversely, if we don't use features simply because they are buggy, browser vendors will think that nobody cares about that feature and focus on something else instead. Because, come on, we all need to prioritize, right? So raising bugs actually will gain you karma points and helps make the web better for all of us. So this is the long list of resources I referred to when preparing this talk, and a lot of articles and books that I found very interesting. So if you need inspiration for vertical layouts, the Tateyoko Web Awards site has a really nice list. Jen Simmons has an experimental layout lab where she showcases all the different things that are now possible with modern CSS. Now, the thing about attending conferences, at least for me, is not so much to gain expertise overnight, but rather to get inspired, to learn of things that I did not know existed, to discover something new, and perhaps gain insights and hear perspectives that never occurred to me before. So all these techniques that I mentioned may or may not be relevant to you right now, and that's perfectly fine. But I do hope that you keep them at the back of your mind, so that one day, when the time comes, you can reach for them and create something truly extraordinary. Ďakujem.